It had been 2 years since the family first moved into their quiet suburban neighborhood. On paper, it was the kind of community people dreamed of. Tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and a sense of order that promised safety. Families waved to one another, children rode bicycles without fear, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings on early morning walks. For many, it was an oasis away from the chaos of the city. The house itself was modest but comfortable. It came with a fenced backyard, and it was there that the family's golden retriever Max found his paradise. Max was more than just a pet. He was a loyal companion, gentle with children, fiercely protective, and the heart of the household. For the kids, he was a playmate who never tired. For the parents, he was a silent guardian who seemed to sense moods and offer comfort without words. Life was stable and happiness seemed constant, but lurking beneath the surface of that carefully maintained neighborhood was tension. Like many suburban communities, this one was governed by a homeowners association, an organization that promised harmony but often delivered conflict. At the center of that conflict was a woman everyone knew but few truly liked. Her name was Karen. Karen was the self-appointed enforcer of every rule, whether written in the HOA handbook or invented in her imagination. She prided herself on patrolling the neighborhood, snapping photos of lawns she deemed too wild, cars parked at the wrong angle, and holiday decorations she thought excessive. Her word carried weight, not because it was respected, but because people feared the endless stream of fines, letters, and harassment that followed if they ignored her. The family had always tried to avoid crossing Karen. They followed the rules, kept their lawn trimmed, and avoided unnecessary attention. But what they didn't realize was that Karen's obsessive eye had already settled on Max. First, it seemed harmless. Karen would comment on how loud a dog's bark echoed across yards, or how some people let their pets ruin the appearance of a neighborhood. Subtle, indirect jabs that hinted at her disapproval. But with each passing month, her fixation deepened. She saw Max not as a loyal pet, but as an intrusion on the perfect picture she thought the neighborhood should reflect. Then came the first letter. A formal notice tucked inside the family's mailbox claiming their dog was in violation of HOA regulations. The wording was vague, accusing them of failure to maintain compliance with noise ordinances and animal control standards. It made little sense. Max was well-trained, rarely barked, and never wandered off the property. But the letter had Karen's fingerprints all over it. The family ignored it at first, assuming it was a mistake. Weeks passed, and the notices kept coming. Each one more severe, each one threatening fines. They appealed to the HOA board, but Karen's influence was powerful. She had been on the board for years and used her authority to silence opposition. Any attempt to challenge her decisions was met with a cold reminder. The rules are for everyone. Still, life went on. Max continued to bring joy to the household. The children played fetch in the backyard, and neighbors who genuinely liked the family often stopped by to scratch Max's head and toss him a treat. Beneath the tension there was still love, still laughter. Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. The children returned home from school to find the backyard gate wide open. Max was gone. Panic set in instantly. The family searched the neighborhood, calling his name, checking parks, and knocking on doors. Hours passed and hope dwindled. It wasn't like Max to run off. He had never left the yard before. As night fell, fear turned into devastation. The family gathered in the living room, unable to sleep, imagining the worst. Had Max been hit by a car? Taken by strangers? Lost and scared in the cold? The next morning, a knock on the door shattered the fragile hope they clung to. Standing on the doorstep was Karen. She held herself with the smug satisfaction of someone convinced of her own righteousness. In her hands was a clipboard, and with an air of authority, she announced that Max had been removed because he violated HOA rules. The words cut like a knife. Removed. Taken. Not lost, not escaped, but deliberately stolen under the guise of regulations. Karen claimed she was simply doing what was necessary to preserve the peace of the community. She spoke as if Max were property, a nuisance to be disposed of. The family's grief turned into fury. They demanded answers, but Karen only left behind a vague warning. Non-compliance has consequences. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some supported the family, outraged by Karen's audacity. Others stayed silent, afraid of retaliation. But one thing was certain. Something far darker was at play. That night, as the family sat in stunned silence, the father decided to check their home security cameras. He had installed them months earlier, never imagining they would be used for anything beyond peace of mind. But when he pulled up the footage, what he saw was more shocking than anything he could have imagined. The cameras had caught everything. There on the screen was Karen herself, approaching the gate, unclipping the latch, coaxing Max out with a leash she brought herself, smiling as she led him away. The family stared at the footage in disbelief. It was undeniable proof. Karen hadn't just orchestrated Max's removal, she had physically stolen him. And now, with evidence in their hands, the battle was about to begin. The footage of Karen leading Max away changed everything. What had once been suspicion and grief turned into a firestorm of certainty. There was no ambiguity, no chance for misinterpretation. The video laid bare the truth. The woman who had claimed to be upholding neighborhood order had committed an act of blatant theft. What made the situation even more chilling was the ease with which she had done it. Karen moved with confidence, as though she believed herself untouchable, a law unto herself in a community she thought she controlled. The family's immediate reaction was outrage mixed with disbelief. They lived in a neighborhood bound by rules, but rules were supposed to protect, not justify cruelty. Yet here was someone weaponizing authority, using it to take what was never hers. It was a violation not just of trust, but of the sense of safety everyone assumed came with suburban living. If a beloved pet could be taken under the pretense of rules, then what was safe at all? News of the footage spread quickly. In tightly packed communities, gossip traveled faster than official notices. Neighbors whispered at mailboxes, lingered on sidewalks, and passed information during school pickups. Some were horrified, shaking their heads at the audacity. Others stayed silent, unwilling to speak out but quietly relieved someone had finally stood up to Karen's overreach. But behind closed doors, people were beginning to take sides. On one side were those who empathized with the family. They had seen Max for years, a gentle and friendly presence who never caused trouble. Children from nearby houses had played with him, and elderly neighbors had found comfort in his calm demeanor. To them, Karen's actions were cruel and unjustifiable. If she could justify stealing Max, then who would be next? Would she decide someone's garden was too unruly and remove it by force? Would she target another family's children under the pretense of safety? To them, Karen's theft was a wake-up call. On the other side were those who, whether out of fear or loyalty, clung to Karen's authority. These were the neighbors who had either benefited from her enforcement or had been too afraid to challenge her in the past. They rationalized her actions as necessary, claiming rules existed for a reason, even if no one could actually point to a specific regulation that justified taking a dog. For them, siding with Karen was easier than risking her wrath. After all, she had a reputation for making life miserable for those who opposed her. The divide grew wider with each passing day. Some neighbors began quietly avoiding Karen, refusing to engage in her usual rounds of gossip and oversight. Others doubled down on their allegiance, offering her support at HOA meetings and defending her decisions with rehearsed lines about community standards. For the family, this was a bitter pill to swallow. They had always believed their neighborhood was built on unity and respect, but now they saw the cracks in that foundation. The HOA board was forced to take notice. At first, they tried to remain neutral, issuing vague statements about misunderstandings and ongoing reviews. But the footage was impossible to ignore. The video circulated quietly, shared on phones, whispered about at gatherings. The board members were cornered, unable to dismiss the situation without losing credibility. Yet Karen's long-standing influence made them hesitant to act decisively. She had allies on the board, people who owed her favors or feared her manipulative tactics. The result was paralysis. Meetings stretched on with heated debates, accusations, and silence where there should have been justice. For the family, this limbo was agonizing. They had the proof, but justice felt distant. Worse, Max was still gone. The footage showed Karen taking him, but not where she had taken him. Each night was spent in restless worry, imagining Max scared and confused, longing for home. His absence was a constant ache, felt in every empty corner of the house, in the quiet backyard that once echoed with his playful barks. The children struggled most, their innocence shaken by the idea that someone they saw daily could commit such cruelty. As the days turned into weeks, pressure built. Neighbors who had once kept silent began to speak out more boldly. They shared stories of Karen's past overreach, fines issued for trivial reasons, intimidation tactics that had gone unchecked, rules bent to her advantage. For the first time, people were connecting the dots, realizing her theft of Max wasn't an isolated act, but the climax of years of unchecked behavior. What had once been tolerated as just Karen being Karen was now exposed as a dangerous abuse of power. Still, the conflict wasn't without consequences. Those who defended the family faced subtle retaliation. Anonymous complaints were filed against them, fines appeared in mailboxes for dubious reasons, and notes were left on doors warning them to stay in line. The atmosphere shifted from neighborly warmth to quiet hostility. Families who had lived peacefully side by side now regarded one another with suspicion, unsure of who was an ally and who was an informant. Through it all, the family held on to the one thing they had: the truth. The footage was undeniable, and while the HOA hesitated, the evidence gave them strength. It was no longer just about Max. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing the neighborhood that Karen's reign of fear had limits. They began documenting everything: letters, fines, interactions, and above all, the reactions of neighbors. Piece by piece, they built a record, not just of their pain, but of a pattern that painted Karen in the harshest light. The turning point came when one neighbor, previously too afraid to speak, quietly approached the family. They admitted to seeing Karen on the night Max disappeared, walking hurriedly down the street with a leash in hand. Their testimony wasn't just confirmation of the footage, it was validation from someone who had once stayed silent. And with that, others began stepping forward too. Stories surfaced of threats Karen had made, of rules she had twisted, of lives she had disrupted. The narrative was changing, and for the first time Karen's power seemed to weaken. But just as momentum shifted, Karen struck back. She filed an official complaint against the family, accusing them of harassment, slander, and disturbing the peace. She framed herself as the victim, twisting the situation to paint the family as aggressors. The HOA board was thrown into chaos again, forced to address her claims while still grappling with the damning footage. The battle was no longer about a missing dog alone. It had become a fight for truth in a neighborhood where fear had silenced too many for too long. Every move, every letter, every whispered word now carried weight. The family had proof, but Karen had power. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the neighborhood was no longer the same. And in the midst of the division, one pressing question remained unanswered: where was Max? The days following Karen's theft became a blur of desperation. Each sunrise began with renewed hope, only to end with exhaustion and unanswered questions. The family refused to let silence be the final word. Flyers were printed with Max's photo and posted across the community. Calls were made to local shelters, veterinarians, and rescue organizations. Every road, park, and corner of the neighborhood was walked, sometimes multiple times in a single day. Yet Max remained missing, and the emptiness of his absence grew heavier with each passing moment. The search was not only physical but emotional. The family carried with them not just the longing to be reunited with Max, but also the knowledge of betrayal. Karen's act had transformed the familiar neighborhood into hostile territory. Every glance from a neighbor felt loaded, every hushed conversation a reminder of division. Some quietly offered encouragement, dropping off food or leaving notes of support. Others avoided eye contact, afraid to be associated with the conflict. The tension was palpable, like a storm building without release. Despite the weight of uncertainty, the family pushed forward. They sifted through the footage over and over again, analyzing every detail, every frame. The way Karen held the leash, the direction she walked, the time of day. All were scrutinized in the hope of finding a lead. They began mapping out possible routes she could have taken and considered every location she might have hidden Max. Yet nothing concrete emerged. Karen had been careful, and her silence was its own cruel weapon. Still, cracks began to form in her carefully constructed facade. Neighbors started noticing inconsistencies. Some reported hearing a dog barking from her property late at night, though Karen denied ever having one. Others recalled seeing her car leaving the neighborhood at odd hours, as though she were transporting something she did not want anyone to see. Each new whisper added fuel to the growing suspicion, but suspicion was not enough. The family needed proof. The HOA board, caught in the middle, attempted to control the narrative. They urged patience, promising an internal review, but the community had grown tired of their evasions. Meetings devolved into shouting matches, with residents demanding accountability. For years, Karen had ruled through fear, but now, for the first time, her power seemed fragile. The theft of Max was more than a single act of cruelty. It was a catalyst that exposed the rot beneath the surface of the neighborhood. The family's search expanded beyond the boundaries of the community. Local animal rescues were contacted daily. Volunteers joined the effort, some moved by compassion for Max, others eager to stand up to Karen indirectly. Strangers shared posts on social media, and soon the story began gaining traction outside the neighborhood. What had started as a private tragedy was turning into a public battle, one that drew eyes from far beyond the quiet suburban streets. Yet, amid the growing support, there were still moments of crushing despair. Each night, as the house grew silent, the absence of Max was felt most sharply. The empty bed where he used to sleep, the toys scattered across the floor, the leash hanging unused by the door, all were painful reminders. The children struggled to understand how someone could take away the one creature who had given them unconditional love. The parents bore their grief silently, determined to stay strong, but inside they carried the same ache. The turning point came when a group of neighbors, emboldened by the family's persistence, began sharing more openly. One neighbor revealed that Karen had once bragged about her ability to make problems disappear when it came to enforcing rules. Another mentioned that she had connections with a kennel outside town, a place known for boarding animals discreetly. The family followed every lead, no matter how tenuous, and slowly a clearer picture began to emerge. Karen had not acted impulsively. Her theft of Max was deliberate, planned, and carried out with the belief that no one could challenge her authority. The possibility that Max had been hidden away in a kennel or sold under false pretenses was devastating. The thought of him alone, frightened, and waiting for his family tore at their hearts. But it also fueled their determination. What Karen underestimated was the strength of the bond between a family and their pet. She believed rules and intimidation would silence them, but instead, she had awakened something stronger: resilience. The family began compiling their findings into a comprehensive record. Every statement, every rumor, every shred of evidence was documented. They reached out to local authorities, armed with the footage of Karen's theft and the testimonies of neighbors. At first, officials were hesitant, wary of stepping into what they saw as a neighborhood dispute. But as the evidence piled higher, it became impossible to dismiss. The case was no longer about petty rules or HOA politics. It was about theft, cruelty, and abuse of power. Even as they fought on the official front, the family never stopped searching. They drove through rural roads, checked shelters miles away, and followed up on every call that came in. Each false lead was crushing, but each one also reinforced their commitment. They would not stop until Max was home. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder in her defense. She painted herself as the victim of harassment, claiming she was being targeted for simply upholding standards. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she became. Her words were contradicted by the footage, her denials undermined by the mounting testimonies. Her allies began to dwindle, some withdrawing quietly, others abandoning her entirely. What had once been her stronghold of power was crumbling piece by piece. Still, the question of Max's whereabouts remained unanswered. Days had turned into weeks, and though the evidence against Karen was overwhelming, the family's hearts remained heavy without their beloved companion. They knew justice might eventually prevail, but justice without Max felt hollow. And then a break came. A local rescue organization called with information about a golden retriever, recently dropped off under suspicious circumstances. The description matched Max perfectly. The timing, the location, even the details of how he was surrendered all pointed in one direction: back to Karen. Hope surged through the family once again. The possibility of reunion felt within reach, though tempered with caution. They had been through disappointment before, and they braced themselves for the possibility of another. Yet deep down, something felt different this time. This lead carried weight, and it was tied directly to the one person who had tried so hard to deny her involvement. The search for Max was no longer just a desperate effort. It was turning into a reckoning. Karen's carefully crafted narrative was unraveling, and with every thread that pulled loose, the truth shone brighter. The family knew they were closer than ever to uncovering not only where Max was, but the full extent of Karen's betrayal. And as they prepared to follow this new lead, they understood one thing clearly. The fight was far from over. What awaited them next would not only test their resolve but expose Karen in ways she had never imagined possible. The call from the rescue organization marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle. For weeks, the family had lived in a haze of grief and uncertainty, but now there was a tangible thread to follow. The description of the golden retriever that had been surrendered matched Max with uncanny precision. The same age, the same markings, and the same calm but anxious demeanor that shelter workers had noticed upon his arrival. The timeline of when he was brought in coincided almost perfectly with the night he was taken. The rescue provided further details. The dog had been dropped off by a woman who refused to provide identification, insisting she was rehoming a neighbor's problem pet. Workers remembered her unusual insistence that the animal not be traced back to her, and her dismissive tone when asked about the animal's medical history. It was not conclusive proof, but paired with the footage already in the family's possession, the pieces of the puzzle were aligning in only one possible direction. The family immediately gathered every bit of documentation they had amassed. The footage of Karen leading Max out of the yard, the testimonies of neighbors who had seen her with a leash that night, and now the suspicious circumstances of the surrender at the rescue all told a consistent story. Karen had not only stolen Max but attempted to erase him from their lives by casting him off where she believed he would never be connected back to her. The emotional weight of this realization was immense. To imagine Max sitting in a strange kennel, waiting and hoping for the familiar faces of his family, was unbearable. Yet beneath the sorrow was a growing strength. Karen had always believed she could manipulate rules, bend perceptions, and hide behind authority. But now, hard evidence was accumulating against her, and the cracks in her defense were impossible to ignore. The family's decision to involve authorities fully was inevitable. They presented the compiled evidence to local law enforcement, who had initially dismissed the matter as a neighborhood dispute. Now, however, the volume and consistency of the evidence forced a different response. The security footage alone was damning, but paired with corroborating testimonies and the rescue's records, it painted a clear picture of deliberate theft. The act was no longer a petty issue of HOA politics, it was a crime. As the investigation took shape, Karen's position in the neighborhood grew increasingly fragile. Whispers turned into open conversations, and her long-standing reign of intimidation began to falter. Neighbors who had once feared her fines and complaints started to speak more freely. They recounted past instances of overreach, letters slipped into mailboxes threatening baseless penalties, anonymous reports filed against harmless activities, and manipulative tactics designed to isolate and control. For years, these stories had remained private, locked away out of fear of retaliation. But now, the theft of Max had ignited something larger. It became the symbol of everything Karen had represented: abuse of power, disregard for compassion, and the pursuit of control at any cost. The HOA board, which had once tried to shield itself from the conflict, now found itself under scrutiny. The residents demanded accountability. Why had the board allowed Karen so much unchecked influence? Why had they tolerated her behavior for so long? For the first time, the board members were forced to acknowledge what many had known privately, that Karen had used her position not for the betterment of the community, but for her own dominance. As community pressure mounted, the family pressed forward. They ensured that every detail of the evidence was meticulously preserved. The video footage was backed up on multiple devices. Witness statements were signed and recorded. Even the timestamps from the rescue's intake forms were matched against Karen's known movements in the neighborhood. Piece by piece, a case was being built so solid that denial became impossible. Karen, however, did not retreat quietly. Instead, she grew louder in her defense, portraying herself as a victim of persecution. She accused the family of fabricating evidence, insisted that the dog had been a disturbance to the community, and even attempted to claim that her actions had been justified under vague HOA regulations. But her words rang hollow. The regulations she cited did not exist in any handbook, and her increasingly desperate claims only fueled the perception that she was unraveling under the weight of exposure. The turning point arrived when the family, accompanied by officials, visited the rescue. Max was there just as they had hoped. Though thinner and visibly anxious, his recognition of his family was immediate and undeniable. His joy at being reunited with them silenced any lingering doubts about his identity. The paperwork provided by the rescue confirmed what they already knew. Karen had been the one to surrender him. She may have hidden her name, but her description, demeanor, and the timing of the event tied her irrefutably to the crime. With Max safely home, the battle entered its final phase. What remained was not just the restoration of what had been lost, but accountability for what had been done. The evidence now painted a comprehensive picture of theft, deception, and abuse of authority. Karen's reputation, once bolstered by fear and control, was collapsing. Her allies withdrew, unwilling to share in her downfall. Even those who had once defended her recognized that the tide had turned. The family, though exhausted, felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer simply about their dog. It was about ensuring that Karen's actions would never be repeated, that no one else in the community would suffer under her unchecked power. The evidence they had collected was their shield, and with it, they intended to hold her fully accountable. The neighborhood itself had transformed through the ordeal. The once quiet streets now buzzed with conversations about fairness, accountability, and justice. Families who had lived side by side in polite distance now found themselves united by a common cause. The division that had once torn them apart was slowly being replaced by solidarity. The theft of Max had revealed not just the cruelty of one individual, but the resilience of many. Yet even as the family celebrated Max's return, the story was far from over. Legal proceedings loomed ahead. Karen, cornered but still defiant, was unlikely to surrender quietly. The HOA board, facing pressure, was preparing for its own reckoning. And the family, while relieved to have Max back, carried the scars of what they had endured. Their home was whole again, but the fight for justice had only just begun. As the evidence mounted and the walls closed in on Karen, the community braced itself for the inevitable confrontation. What had started as the theft of a beloved pet had become a symbol of something much larger. A battle between cruelty and compassion, fear and resilience, lies and truth. The outcome would not only determine Karen's fate, but would define the character of the entire neighborhood. The news of Karen's actions traveled faster than anyone anticipated. By the time the family was able to collect their thoughts after retrieving Max, nearly everyone in the community had heard whispers about the security footage. What had once been private frustrations with Karen now became a shared outrage. Neighbors who had remained silent for years suddenly found themselves emboldened by the proof of her cruelty. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about a long pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and unchecked authority. Karen had built her power in the neighborhood on fear and intimidation, crafting an image of herself as the guardian of order. She thrived on making others feel small while painting herself as the sole defender of rules that often didn't even exist. Yet, in the span of a few days, that facade began to crack, and beneath it lay the truth of someone who had crossed too many lines. For the family, the relief of having Max safe at home was tempered by the unease of what Karen might try next. People like her rarely admitted defeat. Even when confronted with undeniable evidence, she was the type to twist reality until it bent to her will. The family decided to stay quiet, at least for the moment, trusting that the evidence would speak louder than their words. What they hadn't expected was how quickly others would take the evidence into their own hands. It began with a neighbor 2 houses down, a man who had lived under Karen's thumb for over a decade. He had been fined for everything from the color of his shutters to the number of cars in his driveway. Watching Karen dragged into the spotlight for something so cruel felt like vindication, and he wasn't about to let the opportunity pass. Within hours, he shared his own experiences with Karen online, attaching them to the family's story. Suddenly, the tale of a stolen dog became the spark for a wider reckoning. Other neighbors chimed in, recounting fines, threats, and manipulations that painted a picture of someone who had long abused the little power she had. Each story that surfaced only reinforced the narrative that Karen's cruelty had been deliberate, calculated, and systemic. The footage of her stealing Max, once a deeply personal ordeal, was now proof of something bigger: the collapse of her manufactured authority. Karen, of course, wasn't silent. She attempted to frame herself as the victim, insisting she had been misrepresented and misunderstood. In her version of the story, she had acted in good faith, only to be maligned by vindictive neighbors. She even tried to invoke HOA rules again, claiming she had acted within her rights. But this time, no one seemed willing to buy her excuses. Her pattern of behavior, her arrogance, and her refusal to admit fault made it impossible for anyone to see her as the victim she desperately wanted to be. The HOA board, which had long tolerated Karen's influence, suddenly found itself in an impossible position. They could either continue defending her and risk being dragged down alongside her, or they could distance themselves from her entirely. Whispers began that even within the board, members were tired of her overreach and fearful of what the fallout might mean for them. Meanwhile, the family focused on rebuilding their peace. They had lived with constant anxiety since Max had gone missing, and though he was back, the shadow of Karen's interference lingered. Every time Max barked in the yard, every time footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, there was a pang of unease. Yet, with each passing day, that unease gave way to something stronger: determination. Karen had tried to take something precious, and instead, she had united an entire neighborhood against her. The unraveling of Karen's reputation wasn't confined to the neighborhood. The story spread beyond the community, picked up by local forums and social media groups where people shared stories of overbearing HOA enforcers and petty neighborhood tyrants. Karen's name became shorthand for everything wrong with unchecked authority in small communities. The footage, replayed and dissected countless times, stripped her of any chance to control the narrative. Those who once cowered under her scrutiny began to see her for what she truly was: a bully who relied on others' silence. Without that silence, she was powerless. And without the fear she instilled, her words carried no weight. Karen had tried to justify stealing Max by invoking rules that never existed, and now the truth was exposing her in a way she could never undo. For the family, it was strange to see their private pain turned into a public spectacle. They hadn't sought vengeance. They had only wanted Max home. But the ripple effect was undeniable. Neighbors began knocking on their door, offering support, sharing their own encounters, and apologizing for not standing up sooner. Some even admitted they had once believed Karen's lies, only to realize now how thoroughly she had manipulated them. The community was changing. Where there had once been silence, now there was conversation. Where there had once been isolation, now there was unity. And at the center of it all was a simple truth: one woman's cruelty had been laid bare for all to see, and the people she had tormented were no longer willing to let it continue. Yet, as much as Karen's downfall seemed inevitable, there was still the nagging awareness that people like her rarely went quietly. She had spent years crafting her dominance, and to lose it so suddenly was something she would not accept easily. What would she do next? How far would she go to claw back control? The family braced themselves, knowing this story wasn't finished. The footage had ruined Karen's image, her credibility, and her grip on the neighborhood, but it hadn't silenced her. If anything, it had driven her deeper into denial, into the conviction that she was the victim of a grand conspiracy. And though her power was fading, her desperation was only growing. The family could feel it like a storm building on the horizon. The neighborhood was finally united, but Karen was not done fighting. The damage to her reputation was irreversible, but the true collapse of her influence was still to come. The next move would determine whether Karen faded quietly into obscurity or exploded in one final attempt to reassert herself. The evidence was out there, the community was watching, and Karen's world was crumbling. Yet even in ruin, she wasn't ready to surrender. The family knew this was far from over. And so while Max lay peacefully at their feet, safe and loved, a shadow lingered over their relief. The footage had changed everything, but it had also set in motion a chain of events that would test not only Karen but everyone in the neighborhood who had lived under her reign. The storm hadn't passed. It was just beginning to gather strength. Karen's downfall unfolded like a slow-moving storm that had been gathering on the horizon for far too long. By the time the HOA board finally convened to review the evidence, whispers had already rippled through the neighborhood. The footage of her stealing the dog had not stayed confined to the homeowner who discovered it. It had spread through the community like wildfire. Quiet conversations at mailboxes turned into not-so-subtle exchanges at neighborhood gatherings. By the time the board met, Her reputation was already tarnished beyond repair. The meeting was tense, packed with homeowners who rarely bothered to attend. The air was thick with resentment, the kind that had been festering for years under Karen's self-appointed rule of superiority. The footage was displayed without commentary, and there was no denying what everyone saw. Karen was caught red-handed, taking the dog, smirking with self-satisfaction, and walking away as if she were the ultimate enforcer of rules no one had ever agreed to. The silence in the room when the video ended was more damning than any words. The HOA board, previously hesitant to confront Karen's manipulative tactics, found themselves with no choice. The evidence was undeniable, and the collective outrage of the homeowners demanded action. The board stripped her of any unofficial authority she claimed to have, formally reprimanding her for harassment and overreach. But it didn't stop there. Many residents began calling for her complete removal from the HOA board altogether, citing years of bullying, intimidation, and fabricated rules that had caused unnecessary pain. Karen tried to defend herself, insisting she had acted in the community's best interest, claiming the dog had been a nuisance, and that she was merely upholding standards. But those words fell flat in the face of truth. The homeowners had endured too much for too long. What had once been muttered complaints now turned into a collective voice of defiance. Karen was voted off the board, her authority shattered in front of the very people she had spent years trying to control. The humiliation cut deep. For someone who thrived on appearances, the loss of face was devastating. Neighbors who had once tolerated her fake smiles and passive-aggressive remarks now turned their backs when she passed. Parents pulled their children closer. Whispers followed her every move, and the power she had wielded like a weapon evaporated overnight. Even her closest allies in the neighborhood distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone so thoroughly disgraced. But the consequences extended beyond social standing. The homeowners who had been wronged by her actions, those fined unjustly, those shamed for trivial matters, those harassed for minor infractions, finally found the courage to come forward. Complaints piled up, documenting a history of abuse of power. The HOA board, desperate to restore order and credibility, launched a full-scale investigation into her behavior. Financial records were reviewed, violations were re-examined, and her manipulative patterns became undeniable. As more came to light, Karen's carefully constructed image crumbled. It wasn't just about a stolen dog anymore. It was about years of deceit, control, and cruelty exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. She had claimed to be the protector of the neighborhood, but the truth revealed her as its biggest problem. The more she protested, the more isolated she became, her words carrying no weight in a community that had finally awakened from her control. Meanwhile, the family whose dog she had stolen became an unexpected symbol of resilience. Their decision to fight back, to demand accountability rather than bow to intimidation, inspired others. Where once neighbors kept quiet, now they spoke up. Where once people feared retaliation, now they stood together. The community that Karen had ruled through fear began to find its strength in unity. The stolen dog was returned safe, but its story became more than just about a pet. It became the spark that ignited a long-overdue reckoning. Karen's personal life also began to unravel. The scandal bled into her professional world as well. Employers, clients, and acquaintances stumbled upon the viral clip of her theft, and questions about her integrity spread beyond the neighborhood. Opportunities slipped away, invitations ceased, and the respect she had once demanded vanished without a trace. She became infamous for all the wrong reasons, her name synonymous with the petty cruelty that had once gone unchecked. There was no redemption arc for Karen, no sudden apology, no moment of clarity that erased the years of harm she had caused. Instead, she doubled down on her bitterness, retreating into isolation as the world she had built on control and intimidation collapsed around her. Her downfall was not swift, it was drawn out, each consequence compounding the weight of the last, until she was left with nothing but the remnants of a reputation she had destroyed with her own hands. For the community, her downfall marked the beginning of healing. With her influence removed, the HOA was forced to rebuild trust with its members. Rules were clarified, fines were reviewed, and residents felt they finally had a voice in the place they called home. The air seemed lighter, the tension that once lingered on every street corner slowly dissipating. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now found common ground in reclaiming their neighborhood from the shadow Karen had cast for so long. The family, once the target of her wrath, became a central part of this renewal. Their story served as a reminder of what could happen when good people stood up against injustice, no matter how small it seemed at first. Their beloved dog, once taken as a pawn in Karen's power play, now ran freely through the yard, a living symbol of victory over cruelty. Every bark, every wag of its tail was a testament to resilience and justice served. And so, the story closed not with Karen's triumph, but with her destruction. Not with her silencing others, but with others silencing her reign of fear. It was a story of justice, yes, but also one of community strength, of people finally realizing they were stronger together than they ever were apart. Karen had thought she was untouchable, that her false authority and manipulation would carry her forever. But the truth always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, even the most carefully built lies crumble into dust. The dog was back where it belonged, the family had peace again, and the neighborhood, free at last from Karen's grip, could finally breathe. And that's how Karen's obsession with control and her reckless attempt to steal a beloved pet backfired so spectacularly that it ruined her life. What started as a cruel act meant to enforce imaginary HOA rules ended in her complete downfall. It just goes to show, sometimes justice comes not in a courtroom, but in the courage of ordinary people who refuse to back down. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking HOA and Karen drama stories. New episodes are posted every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.